Why has the government been absent without leave over the summer, leaving the way clear for Nigel Farage to dominate the headlines? Will Keir Starmer's latest reset revive Labour's fortunes? And is the United States sleepwalking to dictatorship? I'm Frank McKenna, and this is the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
The return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Yay, it worked.
So after our very well-earned break last week for our bank holiday Monday, we're back again, the Downtown Den Politics Podcast with me, Frank McKenna, Jim Hancock and Joe Phillips. So let's turn our attention first to the story, the political story that's dominated the headlines for much of the summer then, and that, of course, is immigration. We've had small boats, we always do, during the summer, of course. We've had hotels, rather unusually, coming into play as far as that debate is concerned. And this morning, Yvette Cooper has released a statement with a whole raft of measures telling us what the government are going to do about the challenges that they face. And the context of this is, of course, is that the Labour government inherited what they would suggest being 14 years of mismanagement of the asylum system. Some would say even longer than that. And they would also point to the fact that hotels, for example, are reducing in terms of usage for immigrants. They'd also point to the deal that has been done with France, this one in, one out deal. And they are saying today that the smash the gangs policy, which they adopted a year ago, is starting to come to some fruition because more dinghies have had knives put in them over the August period than ever before. And so they are saying that boat crossings in August actually dropped, but of course across the year, boat crossings up. I've looked at the statement this morning. There's a lot of good stuff in there, Joe, but it's not going to cut through. It's another technocratic statement from a technocratic government that doesn't seem to get 21st century communications.
No. And, throughout the summer, while Parliament's been in recess and what we used to call the silly season, because there was no news, although I think that doesn't exist anymore, Nigel Farage and Reform have been making the headlines. They have been, or he has been, making incendiary comments. He's come out with this, we're going to deport everybody, even women and girls, back to Afghanistan. We'll do a deal with the Taliban, and so on and so forth. And the government has been, frankly, on the back foot throughout. And it doesn't matter whatever measures you announce. The reality is that people need to see change. And I think the hotels thing, although it has been inflamed, I think, by agent provocateur on the right, the council didn't go to court until the protests happened, but actually that hotel had been used for housing asylum seekers for many, many years. But of course, it's now become symbolic, and the fact that the government won, and whether Epping or not goes to the Supreme Court and then wins, who knows. But until people see those hotels emptied, and until they see fewer, particularly young men, hanging around on their street corners in areas where they didn't used to be, it's not going to make a blind bit of difference. And we know we can blame it on the previous government. We can blame it, as you say, Frank, going back a lot further. Starmer really needs to take this fight to Reform and say, but a lot of it is to do with Brexit. Who called for Brexit? You did when you were running UKIP. And until we actually face up to that reality, which I don't know why Starmer's so lily-livered about it, it's a problem that's not going to go away. And it is the biggest problem facing the government because it is getting huge traction in the papers and on television and on phone-ins. And everybody, I mean, I don't know what it's like where you are, but around here, you know, even in the sort of leafy suburbs of Kent, there are flags flying albeit half-mast on lampposts, and you think, oh, good Lord, have we got plague or something? Zebra crossings have got red crosses on them. Road signs, which obviously council taxpayers have to then pay for them to be cleaned, with really unpleasant signs like "Stop the boats, migrants go home." I mean, it is vile, but it's not going to get any better until there is something other than, as you say, Frank, a technocratic piece of waffle.
You'll not be surprised to know that sat here in Liverpool, there is not an English or Union Jack flag to be seen, because Liverpool doesn't do that sort of thing. But I travelled down to Wolverhampton on Saturday to watch the Mighty Blues beat Wolverhampton Wanderers 3-2. Just get that note in. And Jack Grealish, who of course is a fabulous English footballer, was the star of the show. Many, many bridges draped with flags. So that again is something that has taken off, and we've got to accept that some people are feeling really strongly about this particular issue. Jim, it struck me this morning when I was trying to think of how, if I was in government or a government advisor, I'd be trying to handle this situation. First of all, I have to say I wouldn't have let the field clear during the whole of August for Nigel Farage to dominate the headlines. Taking that aside, if my tactic was to come back with a shock and awe policy that was going to get people to say, woof, this is interesting stuff, at last the government are taking us seriously, I was thinking, what would a statement have been received like that said something like, the government have announced today David Blunkett is coming back as the Tsar to control immigration. He's going to laser focus on the issue. The government have brought forward its initial plan to close all hotels by 2029 to 2027. They've also announced that they'll be re-entering negotiations with the French and other EU partners and telling them that ECHR rules are going to be temporarily abandoned whilst this crisis is sorted out. And the third country option, even Rwanda, will be back on the table if the EU countries, and France in particular, don't start to take the issue seriously. One in, one out isn't going far enough. Imagine that sort of statement coming from Yvette Cooper today. What sort of response that would get, instead of, as I say, all very good measures, all pointing to progress, but it won't cut through, Jim.
No, well, we listened to, I don't want to be over flattering, Frank, but your blog last week on this issue has been widely praised, and rightly so, and you've added to it this morning. I'll come to that in a moment. I mean, it is amazing that the polls are showing that this issue is above the economy or the health service in terms of people's recognition. Now, that's partly a product of the vacuum of August and things like that, but nevertheless, for it to be ahead of those issues is quite remarkable. The problem for the government and the Conservatives, for that matter, is that Farage has set the bar. And therefore, when you get this statement from Yvette Cooper, an inadequate statement that you've analysed, it seems tepid. And, Farage, I've written down two words here, drastic simplicity. That's his solution, but it is attractive. And we sort of, I can't forecast the future, but you sort of think that slowly the Conservatives more rapidly and Labour reluctantly will edge up towards that bar that Farage has set. But of course, as Joe said, he'll get no credit for it because, let's have the real thing, this desire for authenticity, even at the expense of proper scrutiny of Farage, which doesn't go on. This is the problem for the parties. And the particular stress for Labour, of course, is, I don't want to characterise your position as blue Labour, but, that idea of Blunkett sort of sums up what I want to say. There are those realists in the Labour Party that say, what's the wider project? Keeping a Labour government in office for all the things that we want to do, not to exit to a torrent of reform victories in 2029. So we've got to have our eye on the prize. And if it means compromising with what might be our basic instincts, we've got to do that. We've got to, all the measures you outlined just a few moments ago. But of course, there are in the party, and I don't know, it's 50-50 or whatever, people who say our Labour values are contradicted by everything that Farage stands for. We don't see, partly because a lot of them live in North London and places like that where this isn't so much of an issue. We don't see this as the top priority issue. Our great traditions of passion have got to prevail. And of course, those people now have this Corbyn alternative, internationalist party. Corbyn's always sort of championed that sort of thing, being compassionate. So it's a real problem for the Labour Party in particular.
But I think, Jim, what I would say is that, however left-wing you are, the idea of giving Serco and hoteliers literally billions of pounds a year to mismanage the asylum system is not particularly socialist, nor is, I have to say, sticking people into hotels long term. It's a miserable existence. Anyone who stays in hotels on a regular basis, as I do, it's not a pleasure. It's an absolute pain in the arse. So the idea that families are shoved into hotels and are having an absolutely fantastic time. So again, in addition to the points that I made there in terms of the sort of statement I'd been making as the government this morning, I'd be saying as well, and to replace the hotels, we're going to build purpose-built detention centres. They're going to be very nice, they're going to be pleasant, but people are going to be properly policed, and therefore we'll be able to get the applications through quicker, which in fairness to the government, they are doing and doing very successfully. But unless and until they start to create that pushback, that narrative, and these TikTok moments, as we'll describe them, Joe, where people actually say, oh, I get that. And let me just point, we've talked a lot about Nigel Farage and the field being left open to him over the August period. There was this guy, and it was the team in the office who brought this particular issue to my attention last week, I have to confess. I think his name's Rylance. Just after our producer, Francesca, is that right? Rylance, yeah. So he goes on a popular breakfast programme on ITV, Good Morning Britain, comes out with an absolute diatribe of shite. Okay, now, in fairness to the lad, he subsequently said, oh, I got me facts wrong there. He was saying things like they go into these hotels, they get 3 meals a day, they get iPads, they get 50-inch televisions to get blah, blah, blah. Now, it's two things about that. I mean, firstly, it was a disgrace that the people who were interviewing him just sat there nodding along, suggesting that this was all factual stuff. And as I say, this is a popular breakfast programme. It's not even a political platform that he's talking on. Worse than that, though, I was imagining again, what would Alistair Campbell have been doing had he been sat in number 10 watching that broadcast coming through live? He'd have been on the phone immediately to the producer of GMB, giving him the hairdryer treatment and saying, I demand that tomorrow morning at the latest, we have a government minister on putting the facts straight. You are not going to be allowed to put that sort of diatribe on. And if you do that again, pal, by the way, I'll be speaking to your boss and you won't have a job.
Well, the thing is, Frank, I overheard 2 women in a charity shop here at the weekend discussing it, saying, isn't it awful? The BBC or ITV, whoever it is, want to sack him. Rylan, he was only saying what we all think. And you think, right, okay, so Gary Lineker, a consummate broadcaster, says what a lot of people think, and he gets fired, he gets absolutely chastised. This bloke Rylan, I mean, he's he's just, he's stopped. But he was a presenter, and you're absolutely right. Where have the government been throughout the summer? It has felt like we're back in the dark ages of the duty minister. But where's their speed, their agility? Where's their attack dogs? Where is their Alistair Campbell, their Charlie Whelan? You can't keep wheeling out poor old Pat McFadden. There's only one of him. And they are so far behind the curve. And I was just looking at Yvette Cooper's, the press relief. And it's just, you just think, for Christ's sake, it's written by committee. This is a series of complex issues that need to be. No, it's not in the eyes of the public. You know, what the public see is what's on their street and what's happened to their local hotel where they used to go for parties and weddings and wakes and things. And what people see in the terribly biased press that we've talked about often is stories about iPads and, you know, origami classes and football tickets and, you know, days out to the gym and things. But nobody is actually coming back and doing the rebuttal. That was what Blair got right with Alistair. They had a rebuttal unit set up. And if you haven't learnt from that, from all those years ago, when you know perfectly well you've got a very hostile press, then it's a little bit late in the day. You know, you can't come out with a dreary press release saying, oh, it's very complex and we've got to do something workable. No, you haven't. You rebut it and say, that is a pack of lies. This is the truth.
And I think the language as well has got to change.
Oh.
You know, you've got to be edgy. You've got to be disruptive. And I've been talking to a lot of people over the summer in the Labour Party about this. And some people are drawing the conclusion, Jim, that actually the problem is Keir Starmer. How do you communicate in an edgy, disruptive way with a leader who is so embedded to tradition? You know, he says that his favourite Labour Prime Minister is Harold Wilson. Well, Harold Wilson wouldn't be able to survive a minute in modern politics, probably, given the situation that, you know, when we had the 10 o'clock news and that was the only news channel that was on, then you could be pacey. You could basically take your time and be thoughtful about what you were going to do. Let me just read this tweet out from Keir Starmer. Is it called a tweet anymore? Is it called an X? I don't know what these things are called anymore. Anyway, listen to this to get your juices flowing. Keir Starmer. A good education breaks down the barriers to opportunity. My government is investing in our kids' future through free breakfast clubs, expanded mental health support, and improved school attendance. Our plan for change will give every child the best start in life. Now, who the fuck is going to even notice that?
You're not. And it's not a tweet.
Well, it's a statement on a platform that is basically made for people coming up with sound bites. And for me, unless and until they get to grips with this new modern way of communicating, they are going to be absolutely screwed because, as I say, Farage and Flip and all the rest of them today, I'll be jumping on Yvette Cooper's statement and saying, well, it doesn't go far enough. You know, they'll just push back. And, you know, again, in terms of the Rylands thing, I'd have been, as a government minister, taken to X, taken to TikTok and what other platforms the people who follow that guy are actually looking at and saying, nice fella, that guy, but he's an absolute dickhead. You are getting your 5 minutes on the news once you use that sort of language. You've got to be more provocative.
Take Ryland to a hotel and get him to talk to some of the people that are there. Have a conversation.
You've just, Jim, it's not rocket science, this stuff. Why are the government being so poor at this? We've been talking about it now for over a year.
I suppose there might be a sort of residual feeling that we are the government, we are the statesmen, we don't want to get down in the gutter and all this sort of stuff, which is completely naive. You've got to be on TikTok, you've got to be on social media, you've got to be where people are consuming their news. And sadly, from my point of view, it's less and less on conventional terrestrial television news bulletins. But you've inspired some thoughts in my head about this. Of course, the Labour Party did have a leader once, when I was in my early days of reporting, who certainly lacked charisma, but was the most successful Labour government there's ever been, and that was Clement Attlee. But he had around him giants, the Bevans, you know, Nye Bevan and Ernest Bevin, and then coming on to Harold Wilson, who was quite a good communicator himself. But you had Dennis Healey, you had Barbara Castle, who would take the Labour message. And then, of course, under New Labour, Tony Blair himself did it very well. And they realised that was one of the changes of New Labour, actually, realising the beginnings of the change of the communication revolution that we've had. So you're absolutely right. So what are we going to do about it? Do we put, I mean, there are some able ministers around. who could front up. I mean, Thomas Simmons is quite good, but he's in a quiet sort of way. McFadden, I've said before, and I don't want to be unkind, but he is the undertaker. He is not the man for this job. So do they put up front someone like Luke Pollard or Peter Kyle, or, and I know this isn't going to happen because I don't think the Secretary of State for Health would want to move from the job that he's doing to this bed of thorns. But, you know, someone, if Wes Streeting would take it on, he is the person who's got the ability to sort of deliver the messages that you've indicated. But, you know, it's got to change. You've got to meet rhetoric with rhetoric, but, you know, back it up with facts. I mean, you know, and the government have access to the facts, whereas these television presenters and Nigel Farage are not in government, do not have full access to the facts. But use the facts. If you've got a good message, find a way of punching back. And it's so defensive, Frank. This is the problem. You know, this is what I said earlier. Farage is out there in front, you know, setting new bars and so on, and the government's just defensively edging forward.
Well, Joe said the government were on the back foot over August. I think they were on the back. I mean, they just didn't at all come back with anything. And I take your point in terms of those government ministers, Jim. But as I say, I think a czar in the form of somebody like Blunkett, the grandee, very good communicator, good on the media, obviously a great reputation from his time in government himself. And it puts Farage at a particular level then as well. He is then debating, not with the Prime Minister, not with a government minister, but with somebody who, okay, very well respected and a well-known politician, but not in government, and somebody who could basically say, I'm spending 24/7 on this issue now, and these are the measures that we've put in place. And actually, Nigel, you're wrong. And you've got to get into that sort of conversation. You can't simply continue with these lines about, well, he's a fascist, well, he's simplistic, well, he's this, well, he's that. Well, it doesn't really matter. If people's perception is that we've got an immigration crisis in this country, I don't think we have, but that's the perception, then you've got to tackle it as if it is a crisis. And again, somebody said last week, why aren't they treating this in the same way the government did with the pandemic? Like, it's not a crisis. Let's all focus, or get a team of people, a unit of people focusing on this issue. The final point I want to make, Joe, before I'm going to ask you a very challenging question about Keir Starmer's latest reshuffle and reset, because it's happening now, so you're going to have a quick look at your phone. But before that, you've mentioned that you've got some reform councillors and you've mentioned flags. It did tickle me to learn last week that the council that's been one of the most firm and efficient in terms of removing flags because of health and safety concern is a reform council. So there you go.
Yeah. Well, just on the reform thing, I mean, you know, I know we're going to talk about America later, but I can't help but have a wry smile that while they're banging on about free speech in the context of Lucy Connolly and all the rest of it, and apparently Farage is going to raise it with Trump, it is Reform, Nottingham Council, who have now decided they will not engage with the local paper. All their councillors have been banned from speaking to the local paper. They're boycotting it because they didn't like what the local paper wrote about it. I mean, dear God in heaven, they have no sense of irony. But that's the sort of thing that a good rebuttal unit should be coming out with. You know, this is what Reform's doing. Here in Kent, the Reform County Council have had to write to Yvette Cooper asking for an extension on visas because there's such a shortfall in social care staff. So, you know, bring that out, keep telling people and move. And you're absolutely right. The COVID, you know, model is great. Get some really sensible people together, you know, whether it's Louise Casey, whether it's David Blunkett, whether whoever it is, just bring them together and go, right, let's get these people moving. It's this state of nothing. And, you know, if Epping continues and all those other hotels and they don't get emptied, where do all those people go to?
Yeah. But, you know, Labour have got councils that are going to take the government to court. That's the fact of the matter, because they're under pressure from their local residents as well. The point is, and I'll give a plug to one of our partners, Starship, who do these modern methods of construction. You could throw up good quality detention centres within a week. And have people housed in there, as I say, probably far more comfortably than they are in hotels. It's a signal to the people who are genuinely concerned about immigration. It's a kick in the teeth for Farage and co, who are peddling, we know and understand, absolute fantasy politics, but most people are listening to it. And the final point on this, Jim, before we go to a short break, if they don't quickly begin to get a grip of this issue, then it does remain as the number one concern, because it's the thing that most people are now talking about. It's not the fact that waiting lists have been reduced by 4,000. It's not the fact that investment has been made into breakfast clubs. It's not the good stuff that the government are doing. It's going to all be about immigration, and anything else is just lost in the noise.
Yeah. Yes, and it is. I mean, there was a very good story yesterday about naval procurement, which is going to keep thousands of jobs in building ships, but it's fifth, sixth down the list in the news bulletins. It's got to be tackled urgently, and bring in. Louise Casey is another good name. I mean, Blunkett. My only concern is that people like our producer Francesca might not even have heard of him, but he does speak with authority. But perhaps with Blunkett in the background and Casey, somebody in that sort of, you need that authority and you need the energy and something like that to turn it around. But they're changing their director of communications. I see from this flashes.
Well, we're
going
to go into
James
that
Lyons
now.
Okay.
Let me just stop you there, because we'll talk about the reset in a moment. That must be at least the third reset, I think, of the government now. And just one final point on that, Jim. It's a good one. And I think there's a difference, isn't there, between somebody who we all know and feel is the right sort of personality and character, to the electorate today who maybe need a fresh face. But I think Louise Casey's a good shout, but there'll be others out there as well. Needs to be someone who knows the mechanics of government. And again, maybe another idea that Yvette may have come up with today is this issue is just too big for the Home Office now. We've got policing to look after, we've got prison, we've got this, we got this, we got that. We're going to carve that out now. Immigration is going to be its own department, and maybe actually appoint a minister to go off and do this thing in a way that people feel is being taken seriously. And sadly, despite all of the efforts and all of the good and positive things the government have achieved in this area, it just isn't cutting through. And we are sleepwalking at the moment to a reform government in 3 years' time or 4 years' time. So when we come back after the break, we're going to talk about Keir Starmer's latest attempt to address Labour's slide in the polls. Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to the Downtown Den Politics podcast with me, Frank McKenna, Jim Hancock and Joe Phillips. We're going to turn our attention now to Keir Starmer's reset, which is being announced as we are recording. So certain appointments have already been made, and we're going to dig into those. But somewhat concerning, I think, is the fact that this is, by my count, the third reset that Keir Starmer has had, and we've only been in office as a Labour administration for 13 months. So that I think is evidence enough that things are perhaps not going as well as they may. And of course, this comes on the back of, yes, the immigration story dominating the headlines over the summer, but also Labour's poll ratings being in the toilet. I'm seeing polls now saying that they are around 20%, which is worst performance of a government for a long time. So let's just start digging into some of these changes that are going to be made. Now, the first thing to say is that some of the people who are leaving Downing Street apparently are going off to do other jobs, and that is all fine and dandy. Again, perception may suggest that the fourth senior Starmer aide who's leaving Downing Street in less than a year is demonstrating some form of crises and mismanagement within Downing Street itself. So that's not good news. But the people that are coming in to not just steady the ship, but to move it forward, the big name, I suppose, is Darren Jones, who was Chief Secretary to the Treasury and is now going in to take over the day-to-day delivery of the Prime Minister's priorities. So, Jim, what do we make of that particular appointment and others that you may have spotted?
Well, Darren Jones is he's a very, very intelligent, very sharp guy, but I mean, and is a grade above Pat McFadden, who's been doing this sort of job. And he may pull it off. He certainly has the intellectual heft to do it, but he looks a bit intellectual. And I'm not sure he's going to be able to conjure up the colourful phrases, which in the first half of this podcast we said were absolutely essential. So intellectually, very clever, grasping his subject, grasping the political importance of the job that he's been given, which is a new position, chief secretary to the Prime Minister. I think that's I've never heard that title used before.
Yes, you have. It was Steve Baker had it to Steve Barclay was Boris Johnson's.
The trouble with having a nerd on the podcast, Frank. Anyway,
oh, thank you.
So we'll
anything from the 21st century, Joe. Jim is struggling with. That had been an appointment made in 1905. He'd have known all about it.
Yeah, he's probably reading the updates on Papyrus.
Papyrus is the correct pronunciation. Anyway, we're getting catty here. And then Tim Allen, that's an acknowledgement. We were talking about, New Labour's flair for communication, a big figure in the Blair era coming in as director of comms. So maybe the combination of those two will work. A lot of the other names that Joe will be able to recite to you in detail are advisors around which no one's ever heard of. Now, obviously, in the totality of presentation, Starmer's obviously realising he's not getting his message over. In the background, in the sort of, the workshop of Number 10 and in government, that might all contribute. But, you still need the front people who are going to go on TikTok, modern media, and actually put it over. So we'll see whether all those other appointments of people we've never heard of actually works. The last thing I want to say is that I've always been sceptical about this idea of a ministerial shake-up. I thought it would have been done at the beginning of August. It was going to be done. Over the weekend, we had a further feverish speculation that he was going to shake up, particularly junior ministers. Doesn't seem to be any sign of that. I don't know what you guys think of whether that's going to happen or whether it will help Labour in the predicament that Frank's illustrated that they're in.
Yeah, I'm not sure that there is an appetite at the moment for a ministerial shake-up, either at junior level or certainly above. But just putting this into some sort of context in terms of the changes being made, one of the criticisms that has been levelled at Starmer is that he's allowed Rachel Reeves far too much freedom. He's not had his own economic advisor in situ. That has been changed on the back of today's announcement. So he is going to now have an economist sat alongside him and looking at Reeves's proposals, I guess, before they are announced. And hopefully that is somebody who's not crunching numbers, but looking at the politics of those announcements, because that's what has been sadly lacking in terms of some of the pronouncements from the Chancellor. We've then seen James Murray promoted to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, replacing Darren Jones. Darren Jones's new position is interesting, and I guess is on the back of his very successful negotiations with all of the cabinet over the budget last year or earlier this year, because he was the guy who was basically sent into bat to tell people like Angela Rayner, like Yvette Cooper, they were the losers as the NHS and education were given additional cash, and apparently he handled that extremely well. So it's clearly there's some guy who has good negotiation skills, is able to cut deals. When I've seen him on TV, Jim, he's performed pretty well, to be fair to him. It's somebody I've met on a number of occasions, and he's a very personable guy as well. He's young, 35, 36, so he will get the new media age better than most within the cabinet. So I think that might be one of his better appointments. Tim Allen, as you say, former advisor to Blair. James Lyons has gone from Director of Strategic Communications. You will say, Joe, that was expected anyway, but you may want to make a comment about James Lyons. And somebody else who I know quite well, Vidya Alexon, has been given extra responsibilities. She's Deputy Chief of Staff in Number 10, and now she'll be having overall oversight of policy and delivery within Downing Street. Again, I would say a promotion there for a very able and talented young woman. So we'll see. Joe, what's your makings of this?
Well, I think I agree with you about Darren Jones. I've done some events with him, and he's very good. He's very personable and actually very human. And Jim's right. I mean, he has got a good brain and intellectual, but he's not stuffy. He's a good bloke, I think. The problem is timing. And only last week, Starmer replaced his civil servant, Nin Pandit, who is his principal private secretary. Wouldn't you have thought that they would have coincided all of these things to do in one go?
Definitely.
Because otherwise you've got, it looks like panic. That's how it's being reported in the Daily Mail, and doubtless will be reported in the Telegraph and other outlets over the next 24 hours. Instead of which, they could have done it last week. They could have announced it at the same time as they replaced Nin Pandit. There's not going to be any big changes. I think the point that Jim made before the break about, is it time for the Home Office to have a separate unit that only deals with immigration? That would have been a smart and clever thing. And at that point, you bring in your COVID-like team to run it, allowing Yvette Cooper to get on with all the other stuff that the Home Office has got to deal with. That would have been smart, clever, and responsive. This just looks, to most people, a bunch of young men in suits. One of them's only been an MP for a year. And it will also look like, so he's lost James Lyons, although he was never intending to stay very long. James Lyons replaced Matthew Doyle, who had previously worked for Tony Blair. He only lasted a little while. Sue Gray, we all know about. You've got this sense of churn. You've also got men in suits. Where are the young women? Where are the bold faces? Where are the black faces, the brown faces? This doesn't look much other than shifting the middle management of a branch of Sainsbury's. And if this was a football team, as we were just saying in the break, Frank, you can shuffle the players, you can change the formation, but there is a point when you think, actually, we need to change the manager.
And that brings me to the final point of this conversation, in a sense, and we're going to talk about the Deputy Prime Minister in a moment as well, Angela Rayner. But Keir Starmer, Jim, how much trouble do you think on a personal level he's in, or do you think Labour is just too loyal to its leaders for us to be seeing any movement against him?
Yeah, he's two things are true. He is in trouble. He is a technocrat. He needs people around him to be spelling out his message. You can do it like Clem Attlee did, providing you've got good communicators around you and forward momentum. So he is in trouble in that respect. But then we come up against the other thing, which is the incredible loyalty of the Labour Party to its leaders. Whilst the Conservatives dispense with ineffective leaders with ruthless efficiency, so sometimes to the point of parody, of course, it becomes a circus, but nevertheless, you don't last long if you're not delivering the goods in the Tory party. Neil Kinnock was given a further term in 1987, and there's other examples of it. So the party is very reluctant to dispense with its leader. And as I think we're about to discuss, the obvious alternative is beginning herself to run into trouble.
Yeah, I think that Keir Starmer's got another year. I think that, again, we talk about 20th century against 21st century. culture. I do think that there's an awful lot of Labour MPs who will not want to simply be one-term members of Parliament, who will, if necessary, wield the knife. And I think that if you looked at the Sunday Times yesterday, an awful lot of off-the-record quotes basically saying, we'll be looking carefully at the elections next year in Wales and Scotland, local election campaigns as well happening, of course, and mayoralties. And I think if Labour gets a stuffing and it doesn't recover at least 4 or 5 percentage points in the polls between now and then Keir Starmer could actually be under pressure. That then, of course, leaves the big question as to, well, who would you replace him with? And that, I think, is a more difficult question because, as you say, Jim, one of the favourites would absolutely be Angela Rayner. Angela is despised, I think is not strong enough a word to use by the right-wing press. They've been after her for years and years now. Working class woman made good, of course, and that always pisses these sort of establishment owners of the traditional right-wing media off. But I don't know, Joe, whether you would agree or disagree that she may be, again, in danger of not necessarily handling her own personal communications as effectively as she might.
Yeah, and somewhere along the line, you need somebody who says to you, how is this going to look? Jim and I do it for a living. You've done it, Frank, in your professional and political life. You have to have somebody who says, right, I'm not your friend. This is how it's going to look when you take those free suits and those $2.5 grand specs from Lord Alley, which is what Keir Starmer did. And good luck, Angela. You've bought a flat in Hove. It's nearer for you to pop down for the weekends. Why shouldn't you? The press are vile, and there is something so disgustingly misogynistic and snobbish about the way Angela Rayner has been treated. She doesn't know her station, and these awful photographs of her, looking slightly plump in a kayak or something with a bottle of wine and a vape. Well, good luck to her. She's on holiday. She can do what the hell she likes. And frankly, having seen photographs of Boris Johnson on holiday, I'd rather see Angela Rayner. But, there was Boris Johnson borrowing money to have wallpaper that cost more than most families live on for a month. And there was a bit of tutting. Here's Angela Rayner, who apparently has done nothing illegal, but there are questions about whether she changed the ownership of her property in Ashton-under-Lyne in order to evade or avoid tax. Now, you get all of those things done first, don't you? And you get ahead of the pack and you say, well, hey, you put it on TikTok or X or whatever. I'm so excited to be living in Hove. Really love it down here. Yes, of course, I want Peter Carl's safe seat. How do I get rid of him? But you do it so you are setting the agenda. You don't wait for people who are going to come out with stuff and then not answer the question and go, well, I haven't done anything illegal. I mean, haven't done anything illegal just makes people think, no, but you thought you could get away with it.
I think the problem that all Labour politicians have, but particularly politicians such as Angela Rayner, is it's not illegal, doesn't quite cut the mustard, does it? Because people will always say, well, you're the working class champion. So it's not just about the legality, it's about the morality. Now, you and I, Joe, would say, well, what a load of shite that is. And, the point that you make about Johnson's wallpaper, and I could make the point about Sunak's property portfolio, never mind, but it doesn't matter. I mean, again, it comes back to that point of the reality and the perception and what that looks like. And they are after her. She's aware that the right-wing media have been after her for some time. And so for me, Jim, she should have rolled the pitch far better than she has. And in fact, I don't know what the difference in terms of paying council tax in Hove in comparison to paying council tax in Ashton-under-Lyne is, but it's pittance. just take it on the chin if it's an extra grand or an extra £2,000. And the other slight pushback I'd have on Joe's comments, and you may or may not agree with this actually, Jim, but again, when we were into that New Labour stuff, one of the things I said to our candidate in West Lancashire, who I was managing, was get yourself a haircut, get your beard trimmed, and get yourself a decent fucking suit because you look like a scum. Now, that wasn't being misogynistic. It wasn't being snobby. Working class people in particular care about how their politicians look. And so, whereas I'm not in the least bit offended at Angela Rayner or any other female politician taking to a boat, having a bottle of wine and having a vape, I think the Deputy Prime Minister has got to be conscious as to how that looks to the general public. And I tell you now, Joe, if my mum and dad were alive, they would be horrified at that image of a Labour Deputy Prime Minister looking like that. So it doesn't bother me, but I think many working class voters, Jim, would be saying the state of that.
Yeah, well, Joe may want to come back to you because I utterly agree with you. It's a very harsh world. I absolutely associate myself with what Joe said about the misogynistic and snobbish. We're in 2025, for heaven's sake, and we still, these working class women, they should know their place. That's the sort of narrative behind the Mail's coverage of her. So I absolutely think their attitude to her is disgraceful. But you don't give them the opportunity, and that's where it gets really tough. There's some comparisons with Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York. That toe-sucking photograph did for her in a way. Now there was a sort of admiration for her being a bit of a royal rebel and that sort of thing, but she wasn't really taken seriously thereafter. You've got to be extremely careful with these stories. And then you start getting this stuff, which may be mischievous speculation. The thought that you talk about her fancying Peter Kyle's seat in Brighton or whatever it is. I think that's unlikely. But, there's speculation that, obviously some of her neighbours, but the Daily Mail pick on the neighbours they want to talk to in Ashton-under-Lyne. But you've got this story starting up that she wants to escape and do a chicken run somewhere else. Well, she got 11,000 majority. She's frightened of that. But all this doesn't help. And, we've talked about, the possible future leadership contest and the huge pressure the party is under for a woman leader, if not now, when? That is a huge issue. And Angela was well presented at that. She slightly distanced herself from the Prime Minister. You referred to Darren Jones having to tell her there is no money left or whatever. I'm exaggerating, but you know what I'm saying. So she's done, she's presented herself politically as an alternative without being disloyal to the Prime Minister. But you just feel that this has not been a good August for Angela Rayner.
No, and I think that, the thing that you've got to look at if you are serious about being Prime Minister is you've got to have all your ducks in a row, Joe. And I do, sadly, it does mean appearance. And did Boris Johnson get away with things that others did? Well, yeah, in the same way as Trump did. But Rishi Sunak didn't. Rishi Sunak stood out in the rain, made himself look like a wet wanker, and got absolutely pilloried for it. So I don't think you can simply say, well, because she's a woman, she gets loads of stick for her period. I think politicians in general do. Johnson was the exception to that rule.
Yes, and I think that's a fair point, because Johnson had spent years rolling the pitch, if you like, to be the lovable clown, the mop-head prankster, the shirt hanging out, all of which were complete foibles and affectations. And yes, sadly, it's a little bit like broadcasting. You always assume the microphone is live. You always assume that somebody is going to hear you, Gordon Brown, talking about that bigoted woman. You always assume that, somebody somewhere, particularly in this day and age, is taking a photograph of you. And it's awful, and it shouldn't be like that. And it puts people off going into politics and other forms of public service and public life. But you have to assume that you are always on show. And actually, if you talk about it is harder for women. It is worse for women because
Yeah, for
there
sure.
is nothing so bitchy and vile. I mean, you will both remember the late Linda Lee Potter, who was so vile about Mo Mowlam, not knowing at the time that Mo was undergoing treatment for her brain tumour. And Linda Lee Potter described her as a Geordie truck driver.
Yeah.
And it was absolutely awful. And that hasn't gone away. And if anything, it's got worse. But the only way you counter it is to always assume it's there. And somebody somewhere is always going to take a photograph of you, because even if you're on a boat in the middle of the Atlantic, there'll be some prat with a drone. But I'm afraid that is part of life. It's part of and I can't imagine Barbara Castle or Margaret Thatcher or Shirley Williams or Claire Short or any of those women politicians, of not that long ago, being caught, or Theresa May, who always looked immaculate. And I think there's that thing that, just to go back to Jim's point about Sarah Ferguson, one of the late Queen's courtiers said of Sarah Ferguson, apparently, vulgar, 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 which is frightfully snobby, but it is, to a certain extent, what you're saying, Frank. People do expect a certain level of, it's Jeremy Corbyn turning up in a donkey jacket to the cenotaph, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
Michael Foot.
Michael Foot, yeah. That is the problem, Joe. And honestly, working class people are the worst for it, right? I've represented working class constituencies for many years, and I always, whenever I went to a public meeting, whenever I went canvassing, whenever I was engaging with people, I was always suited and booted, because they expect that of their elected politicians. And that may be right, it may be wrong, it may be a bit old-fashioned, here's me talking about 21st century politics. But I do think that if you have got ambitions to be Prime Minister and you are sitting Deputy Prime Minister, then sadly, male or female, I would suggest, there is a certain standard that you have to meet. And I'm not sure she quite kept it over the summer. Do I think that politicians should be allowed to kick their shoes off and all the rest? Well, yeah, of course I do. But the reality is you're not going to be able to. As you say, Joe, you're not just dealing with mobile phones. You've got drones and you've got long lens cameras and all the rest of it. So, yeah, I'm not sure Angela has done herself any favours. That certainly doesn't mean she is ruled out of a future leadership contest, of course, because she still has many admirers within the Labour Party and many people, Joe, who would basically subscribe to the first view that you offered, which is, bloody hell, let's get over this. And I can get that expression of sort of anger and frustration as well, in terms of people not taking Angela Rayner, who is a very talented politician, seriously. But if not Angela Rayner, Jim, who else is there?
On the female front, nobody hoves into view at the moment. That's why she's in a relatively strong position. But it's well, as we've always said, there is no vacancy, but there's always leadership elections. So we'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah. Well, I would say that Wes Streeting would absolutely still be in the running. I think he's, of all the ministers, probably performed better than any. I think both in terms of media, but more importantly, the job that he's doing. Will Andy Burnham be on the lookout now for a seat and get back into Parliament and basically offer himself forward? It was described over the summer in a podcast that I was listening to, and in fact as a piece in the New Statesman, as the king across the water. Yeah. So Andy Burnham, again, you could do a lot worse than you're seeking communications advice than talking to Mr. Burnham.
Yes, just on that subject, there's a report in the Sunday papers about the investigation into the Tameside councillors over the tweets that were exposed that led to Andrew Gwynn, the MP for Denton and Gorton, who is now suspended by the Labour Party, but that's been going on a long time, and I'm sure these inquiries are all being conducted very thoroughly. I wouldn't for a moment entertain the suspicion that Labour, the last thing Labour wants is a by-election at the moment. So it's a very interesting situation. Is it because of fear of reform? Is it because they're doing very diligent due process? Or is the seat being kept warm for Andy Burnham? It's one of those politically nerdy little things that I absolutely love.
I thought you were going to say, is it because Number 10 are in fear of Andy Burnham?
Well, there's that as well.
And that's why they're dragging the investigation on. We'll wait and see. You see, again, isn't it strange? I don't think Andy Burnham would have any problem whatsoever in being elected to a seat in Greater Manchester. Even, Labour absolutely bombing in the polls. But I think if Andrew Gwynn did have to step down and Andy Burnham was selected as the candidate in that constituency, I think he'd walk it.
Or remain mayor. He can't because he's police and crime commissioner.
Well, come on, you'd find a way around that, couldn't you?
Well,
I mean, I don't know.
Are we in
Jim,
America?
If you're telling me that he can't stand, then
I understand that's the legal position. It's not the fact that he's mayor; it's the fact that he's a police and crime commissioner. You cannot be a member of parliament.
So you make that a separate thing, as it is in other places where there isn't a mayoralty. You have a separate police and crime commissioner.
Yes, okay, but we're getting into this is the problem Burnham has here. I don't want to detain you because it's quite boring, but procedurally he has a number of hurdles. That you're talking about having to change the law to make it possible for a person to stand. That's not a great look. He's pledged to, serve out his term as mayor, which doesn't end until 28. He also frequently said, "Oh, I love being away from Westminster. That was a waste of time," and so on. It's quite a difficult path for Andy to come back. I mean, I'm sure they're crying out for him.
Some people are.
Jim, as the Home Secretary might say, in speaking non-human, it's a series of very complex issues that we need to assess assiduously in order to make it possible.
Yes, and on that note, we will draw this part of our conversation to a close. I'm sure we're going to come back to the trials and travails of the Labour Party in the coming weeks. Labour Party conference is only round the corner, of course. We're going to take another very short break and we'll be back to talk all things the Orange Lunatic after the break. Okay, welcome back to the third and final part of this week's Downtown Den Politics podcast. I'm going to talk about international affairs and in particular Donald Trump, the Orange Lunatic, and somebody who was pronounced dead on social media channels earlier this week. It was a good 24 hours where Trump has died was trending. So he's not dead. He's up and about again. His makeup is looking more orange than ever, I have to say. He does have some particular bad bruising to his hands, which have basically led to this speculation about his health and so on. And his ankles apparently have swollen up badly. And then somebody else was noticing that he's not been playing as much golf as he once did. But give the guy a break. He is nearly 18. He's, I was going to say running the biggest country on the planet, but I think that would be stretching it somewhat. That all being said, where is he at this moment in time? I'm going to ask you first, Jim, because we said when he was elected, or I said when he was elected, that as I was in real fear that we were going to see a president who would try and become all powerful, who would move America into an autocratic nation. And you said, push back, and reasonably so, that there were too many checks and balances within the United States to allow that to happen. Sadly, I have to say to you, James, that I think what we've seen over the past 6, 7, 8 months are the courts rolling over, having the tummies tickled, and basically allowing Trump to get away with much of what he's wanted to do. You've seen the Senate and the House of Representatives basically fall into line with whatever Trump has said. You're now having Republican states unchallenged doing what we would describe in this country as boundary changes to make those constituencies safe for Trump's party, the Republicans. Democrats are being legally challenged in their redistricting efforts. You've got troops on the streets again in Democratic states where the governors of those states are saying, no problem here with law and order. This is all an absolute farce. And there's genuine fear among Democrats and mainstream Republicans, those Republicans who remain true to their politics, that you could actually see the midterms cancelled, postponed, certainly challenged where Democrats win those seats. And finally, and perhaps most disturbing of all, we have seen opponents of Trump actually having their houses raided and investigations undertaken on the basis that they criticised him or disagree with him. I think, Jim, if this was happening in Russia or China, we would be horrified. But because it's the United States, we're turning a blind eye and not taking it as seriously as we ought to.
No, you've done a roll call of all the things that we should be concerned about, and I am surprised that there hasn't been more fight back. This even to the point of the Federal Reserve, and he's trying to get rid of this woman because of she claimed 2 different houses were in her name, and he's a convicted felon in the same sort of area. So it is pretty spectacular. Overall, I mean, the only reason he's doing this is because I know his opinion poll ratings have reduced to some extent, but at the moment, the American people aren't suffering the economic effects of a lot of this stuff. And of course, as we always say, the economy will eventually decide, because if he doesn't deliver on that, and if people are actually worse off at the end of his term of office, then he will be in trouble, although he'll be going out of office. It is amazing how he's sort of carrying this off with the American people. I mean, he even said at the weekend that to the charge that he is a dictator, he said, well, if I solve crime, perhaps people won't mind. And that is reminiscent. And I don't like lazy references to Hitler and so on. But of course, it was always said that Hitler built autobahns in the 1930s and got the German economy off the ground. And that was, quite important in getting Germany's recovery from the great crash of the 1920s. And if he'd failed, he probably would have been removed from office before he grasped full control of all the levers of power. What I would just say is there are 2 things outstanding at the moment. I mean, obviously, his tariff policy is really integral to the whole project, and at the moment, the appeal court are striking it down. But of course, as you will probably tell us, it's very likely that the pro-Trump Supreme Court will say that he was perfectly legally entitled to use emergency powers to bring in these tariffs. So although there was quite a lot of excitement at the weekend that his whole major international economic policy was coming crashing down in flames, I think people fully expect the Supreme Court to reinstate it. But the one other thing, which I don't think has received as much attention, is Ukraine. I mean, do you not remember 2 or 3 weeks ago, the Anchorage summit? And how this and shaking hands with Putin, and there was going to be a peace settlement, and Putin's just gone back to Moscow and made Trump look utterly ridiculous, and yet so he should pay a massive penalty for that. The man has been tugged along by Putin. The killing and carnage is going on in Ukraine, and this peacemaker, who's obscenely going for the Nobel Peace Prize, which I very much doubt he'll get. The Ukraine thing is a massive international setback for this man who is the art of the deal. Well, he's not been able to do a deal with Vladimir Putin, as the poor people of Ukraine will testify.
But of course, we're not talking about Epstein anymore. And, some people did suspect at the time whether this was being done on the basis of, well, as Joe always says, don't be looking over here, look over here instead. And in fact, if you go back to the point that you've just made, Jim, the big international news really this week is Xi and Putin standing side by side in China, Modi from India there as well, basically creating an alternative superpower. And whilst all this is going on, by the way, Europe is stood on the sidelines doing fuck all, which I find to be outrageous, other than sucking up to Trump and trying to stay on the right side of the guy. I think, the points that Jim and I have already outlined, Joe, but you've also got to point out the attacks that he's made on universities. So academia, again, another fascist trait, is under attack. And Jim says, well, he might not get re-elected. He might not have to. This bugger might just say, well, we're going to suspend elections because the country's in crises. And Jim, you nod your head, and you did last year when I said to you that he was going to introduce all of these measures that were going to start to undermine democracy. And I don't see at this moment in time, other than Gavin Newsom, perhaps, the California governor, anyone really pushing back. And the international community as well is allies. Joe, I don't know if you saw this week the cabinet get together in the White House, where basically they go around the table and they all see how far up his arse they can get.
Yeah, I know, it's revolting.
Because it's absolute, the sycophancy is incredible. But the European leaders weren't much fucking better.
No, I mean, I think, to be fair, and I will push back slightly, I think Europe have united, and there's a great thing that Keir Starmer has done. He's reset our relationship with Europe to be much more positive, and for Britain to be back at the forefront of a lot of those things. He could go a lot further, in my view, and just stop fanning around about Brexit and just say it was a bloody disaster, let's get over it and try and sort it out. And Christine Lagarde has been attacking this attack that Trump has made on the Fed's chairman that Jim alluded to. I mean, you're absolutely right. And what he is doing is going unchallenged, partly because of the way the media works in America. There isn't a BBC. So those people who want to get rid of the BBC in this country, for all its faults, at least it's independent. And anybody who challenges Trump is either, banned from the press briefings or brand, or he'll close it down. And the other thing that is really fundamental and is an absolute, goes back centuries, is the attack on science. I mean, you can go back to the Middle Ages, you can go back further than that, but despots will attack science because they don't want free thinking. And the value economically and in world status to America and its economy and its standing through its fantastic research and science programs are being dismantled, and they will never be replaced. He's just tried to fire the director of the disease and control prevention body because she didn't agree with Robert Kennedy. He had the police or FBI raid John Bolton's house. This is appalling. If he doesn't like what somebody says, even if they are independent, whether it's statistics about the labour market or the finances, close them down. It's shocking, and I find it very difficult because, like both of you, I've got many friends who are American and I've spent happy times in America. I won't be going there anytime soon, but you sort of think, why aren't you fighting back? Why aren't you challenging it? And in a way, it's that thing that we've been talking about in the first part of the programme about why isn't Labour fighting back? Because in a way, it's so relentless. And it will only be when it happens on your street that you suddenly realise, the person who ran that grocery store has been rounded up and taken off to some prison somewhere. The price of eggs have gone through the roof. That person I used to work with has just lost their job. Now my kid can't apply to go to that university. It's only when it comes home, by which point it'll be too late and the damage is irreparable.
Now, I'm really concerned about what's happening in the States at the moment. I think that Trump is the front man for people who are very dangerous. They remind me of the name of that document, Joe, that they produced.
Project 25.
Project 25.
Yeah.
And I mean, that is basically a manifesto to impose dictatorship.
I completely
To do
dismantle
away
the
with
state.
all the do away with all the checks and the balances, and have the strong man in charge of the country. And when people were celebrating the fact that Donald Trump might be dead last week, as inevitably would happen, and if you think that's distasteful, then I just refer you to some of the statements that Donald Trump has made over the past 20 years. But you then look at what the alternative is, and it's JD Vance. And I think he'd be even worse. Younger, I think intellectually brighter, and absolutely bought in to the Project 25 stuff. So be careful what you wish for. You might think the orange one is a lunatic, as I do, but equally, what comes next could be even worse. I think that the big check now, Jim, as to whether my pessimism is merited will be what happens with the midterms, and whether they are allowed, A, to go ahead, and B, if they do go ahead, the results to be unchallenged.
Yeah, well, we will see, but there is, our valued viewers and listeners will make a judgment on our judgments. I cannot conceive that the midterm elections will be stopped. I think that is a step too far. And if that was to happen, then all your apocalyptic predictions would probably be coming. I think Gavin Newsom has made some pretty ebullient statements in the last few days. I mean, the Democrats are in despair, Democratic grassroots, at the lack of fight from their representatives. And another thing, I mean, we've got listing all the things that Trump's done. Did you see Trump's removed the security guards for Harris?
Kamala Harris.
Kamala Harris. What a mean thing to do. And if she's assassinated, oh well, got what is coming to her. I mean, it's a brutality about. Sometimes Trump intoxicates people with his humor, because he can be funny in a sort of black way, but there's a meanness in the man which is really worrying. Talking about appeasement of people and looking to the future, of course, we have this strange relationship between our Foreign Secretary David Lammy and JD Vance. I mean, what was all that fishing stuff about? This is what puts a lot of
again, I heard an interesting sort of analysis of why JD Vance got the full red carpet treatment, so to speak, and that's because maybe our security services and others do recognise Trump's vulnerability in terms of his health, and therefore they're expecting JD Vance to be president within this term of office. And that is speculation, it's not fact. So makes some sense though, Jim.
Yeah, but I think, there's got to be some fight back. And it looks as if Gavin Newsom, who I've always thought was a potential contender for the Democratic nomination next time, is strengthening his position. But he needs a whole lot more fight back by the Democrats. But it is difficult if the courts are supine in the face of all this and don't make judgments that are enforceable against Trump. It is going to be very difficult. But I just cannot conceive that he can cancel elections on an excuse of some sort of national emergency.
What?
I mean,
he's rounding people up on the streets, Jim. Of course he can. He can do what he likes.
I mean,
I think there'd be a huge push. But don't you think there would be a huge pushback by the amount of people?
Because on the 6th of January, after Biden
won, of everything he's done so far.
Yeah, you only have to look at the, as I say, the antics on the 6th of January. Trump would have quite happily overturned the Biden result and continued in the White House. So I don't think this guy should be underestimated in terms of how far he's prepared to go to undermine democracy if it suits his purposes. I don't know, Jim. As I say, I think an even better tactic from their perspective would be to allow the elections to go ahead, but then to put troops on the streets of the blue states, frighten people to go into the voting. Again, look what he's doing with voting ID.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's basically signed an executive order over the weekend to say that every single person in the country has to have a certain type of voter ID, knowing full well that that will basically disenfranchise an awful lot of minorities. He's done that. So, don't try and tell me that this guy will not go to the nth degree to, as I say, undermine democracy. He would have happily basically fiddled that presidential election that Biden clearly won. No question. And, let's not forget that those people who were rioting on that day, what was one of the first things Trump did? Let them out, released them, signed pardon. So I think we've underestimated him. I think we've sleepwalked into it. I think the European leaders, take your point, Joe, they've rallied round together. They become more united in themselves, but they're finding it very, very difficult to know how to manage and handle Trump. Don't ever criticise him, really.
Well, and as you
Maloney,
say,
actually, we said Maloney could be the key player in that summit that happened, and I tell you, she looked more pissed off than any of the fellas sat around that table. She was rolling her eyes
because she's got to play the game of being the blonde bimbo to the other blonde bimbo, hasn't she? I mean, and the other thing is, as you rightly say, 20 leaders of 20 countries go to this thing with Putin and Xi and Modi and all the rest of it. What's their message? You're not calling the shots anymore in the West.
Yeah, for sure.
So,
Yeah, well, listen, let's end the podcast on a lighter note and just tell people about what we've got coming up, or some of the things Downtown and Business has coming up over the next month, because we are into September, back to school, of course, guys. We've got our property conference on the 11th of September in Manchester. We're doing a parliamentary reception with the West Midlands, so we'll be down in Westminster. I think that's on the 15th, maybe even it's the 15th of September. I'm looking at our producer Francesca, who's as blank as I am on those things, and nor should she know any better than I. Her job is an event, but 15th, I think that's
it is the 15th.
It is the 15th, so that's the West Midlands parliamentary reception. We've got lots of things happening in and around the Labour Party conference the following week, so please do go onto our website. That's all the W's, downtownandbusiness.com, to find out what we're up to. And I think it's our birthday party in September as well. Is that right, Francesca? Just nod if that's the case. She's having a look and she's saying, go onto the bloody website and find out yourself.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. So lots of things happening in September. Loads of different political voices that you will be able to come along and hear from. So please do get involved in the Downtown and Business events programme. That's all from us for this week. We'll be back next Monday when we will be reviewing what has happened in Birmingham this week, where Reform are having its conference, and we will see whether the Labour Party, the Labour government's 1999 reset is starting to make a difference. Have a great week, everyone. See you soon.